Hello, everybody from all over Africa, probably all over the world. It's wonderful to have you here. Thank you for joining us. My name is Annika Larsen, and I'm a journalist. Been a journalist for 25 years and have a fair amount of experience with sexual assault and abuse cases in South Africa. As you know, it's something that we deal with on an hourly, if not every few seconds basis. So today is really about a discussion amongst women who care about not just other women, but all victims of sexual violence, especially at times of war. Sexual violence has been used, as we know, as a weapon in conflicts to humiliate, subjugate, and terrorize populations throughout history. And we've seen a lot of it in Africa, close to home, Sudan, DRC, Ethiopia, Mozambique, and Somalia. In Ukraine, thousands of women have been sexually abused and subjected to sexual violence and have become pregnant as a result. But lately, there was an event, say the most recent, that made headlines on October the 7th in the Israel-Hamas war currently raging in the Middle East. And on that day, when 3,000 Hamas militants attacked, there were brutal levels of rape and mutilation and other sexual violence towards men, women, and children. And as we know, women and children are the most vulnerable. But something strange happened. And this is really where this discussion came about that we're having today. Is there a group of women who began questioning in South Africa why very little has been said about the atrocities committed by Hamas in those several incidents that took place on October the 7th. And the question is why? Why do we speak about them so openly in other parts of the world? And yet some of these survivors and those bodies that were found have been denied the brutality that was and the atrocities that were committed against them. What's the reason for this? Is this general denialism? Is it victim shaming? Is it belief that there's a propaganda by the IDF? What's going on in people's minds? And so we felt that it was really a good time to have this discussion, especially in South Africa, we're plagued by gender-based violence. And it's something that we've become quite used to, sadly, in a way. So I want to introduce our panelists who really have been chosen because of their incredible insight into violence, mainly against women and children, but against men as well. And so I'm going to introduce the panel, if I may. Dr. Mushira Aboo Dia, she's an obstetrician and gynecologist at the Hadassah University Medical Center and sexual abuse specialist at Hadassah's Bat Ami Center. Would you just like to put your hand up, Dr. Dia? We're going to call you Mushira. Thank you so much for joining us. Then we have Roseanne Sack. Roseanne, hello. Thank you for joining us. Roseanne Sack is a WAXA member and co-founder of Kolanu, an anti-abuse organization which is based in SA. And then all the way from Washington, we have Danielle Ofek, who started the Me Too Unless You're a Jew movement. Hello, Danielle. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
You did this in response to the global silence around sexual violence perpetrated against Israeli women and girls on October the 7th. And as I said, she's based in Washington, D.C. So we will have questions. We'll take questions after the panel discussion, but if you'd like to start just typing them in to the chat, I think is the best option always. And then we'll deal with those and we'll try and answer as many as we can after the discussion. You can start putting in your questions as soon as you want to, and as soon as I get the go ahead from the timekeepers, we'll jump into those. But it's a Q&A discussion, and it's meant to be a safe and very open space for all of us who've joined. and especially for the panelists, because this is a topic that is quite difficult to discuss. So I'm going to start with Danielle, if I may. Danielle, shortly after the attacks, the news began filtering out about this use of incredibly sadistic incidents. And if you read the Association of Rape Crisis Centers report, which has come out 4 months later after the attacks, the horror and the atrocities were really quite unbelievable, even for someone who's, I wouldn't say ever hardened, but someone like me who deals with this kind of thing quite regularly. Broken pelvises, women bleeding, people shot in their genitals, a lot of them bodies. And when you answer, after you've answered that, we're going to go to a short video clip, but I'm going to ask you quickly why this narrative came about that the victims were lying or that these atrocities were being made up. What's your take on that?
Thank you, Annika. Before I'm diving into the answer, I want to just mention something. You said in your words that the people that did these atrocities, they are militants. They are not militants. They are terrorists. That's what they are. And it needs to start how we put our words, how we put the facts, and it's very important to call them terrorists because that's what they are. So I will dive into the answer. So it's a really good question. I ask myself the same question. Unfortunately, the narrative has changed decades before October 7. On October 7, we saw the change live, but it's changed decades before. I see what happened on October 7 as a lifequake. Lifequake encapsulates the harrowing reality of genocide, portrayed as a seismic upheaval that shatters lives and communities. For decades, we've seen how Hamas and other forces of darkness have entered academia, politics, and humanitarian organizations. And they do this with a clear goal in mind: the genocide of the people of Israel and the eradication of the land of Israel. October 7 was the accumulation of all this, where we saw the genocide of entire families, babies, boys, girls, grandparents, women and men, the sick and the healthy. The people of Israel experienced unimaginable cruelty at the hand of terrorists. Brutal gang rape, horrific mutilation and beheading, ruthless murder. All this live streamed by the terrorists themselves. The land was drenched in the blood of Hamas victims and consumed by fires set by the terrorists. Today, we can see clearly how international institutions contribute to keep and continue this false narrative. For example, the UN and the UN Women are taken as the gold standard in terms of human rights advocacy and women's advocacy, with the assumption that they are truly and the unbiased organization that they are meant to be. Yet, as we've seen over and over since October 7, and even before that, the leadership of both carry very strong biases which inform the work the organizations do. You would accept an organization that champions women's rights to be the first to call out gang rape and gender-based violence. It is beyond disrupting. To this day, UN Women has not led an investigation into the event of October 7, and I'm not talking about the latest report of Pramila. We will talk about it later. And has consistently remained silent with regards to the hostages who were and likely are going through sexual assault as we speak. It's crazy. It's unbelievable. UN Women avoids even naming the terrorists who themselves broadcast their pillaging and rape of Israelis. At the same time, UN Women has still managed to find time to post relentlessly on their Instagram account about Gaza and publish enormous one-side reports about Gaza. Even in a recent report advocating for a man who was likely terror suspected. So when you ask what happened, this is exactly what happened for decades and still.
Danielle, the core of my question is why?
Because these organizations are biased. They have an agenda. Their leadership has an agenda, and unfortunately, it's anti-Semitism.
Let's just play that short video, which is quite an eye-opener in terms of testimony. Thank you, Dan.
The Association of Rape Crisis Centers in Israel says it's found evidence of systemic and deliberate rape and sexual abuse during the October 7th attacks by Hamas on Israel. In a report released today, the organization claims widespread sexual crimes took place at a series of locations across southern Israel and says sexual abuse was not an isolated incident or sporadic cases, but rather a clear operational strategy. The report does not specify how many cases were documented. Hamas has rejected the allegations, a warning the details in the story are graphic. Danielle Hamamdjian explains the work still underway to gather evidence.
As the sun rose on October 7th, more than 3,000 people kept dancing and partying, the loud music drowning out the sound of gunfire. Today, the distant sound of war in Gaza looms over a memorial to the dead here.
The sheer scale of atrocity here at the site of the Nova Music Festival was far beyond anywhere else.
Israeli and UN officials are investigating widespread reports of sexual violence during the Hamas-led attacks, the most daunting obstacle that so few live to tell what happened. Officials say they know of at least 4 alleged survivors of sexual violence. The rest were killed.
Women were found violated, bleeding, with semen on them. We have eyewitnesses who saw women getting raped, gang raped, and set on fire or shot.
Among the challenges in building the evidence, matching witness accounts with specific victims. Chaim Otmanskin is a volunteer paramedic with Zaka, an Orthodox Jewish organization that recovered the remains of those killed in the attacks. He tells us the painstaking work of identifying the dead often relied on photos of distinct features like tattoos. He says he saw a pattern of extreme brutality, including the mutilation of sexual organs with gunfire and sharp objects. One of the women he found at the music festival had her skirt pulled above her waist and was covered in blood. The rest is too graphic to describe.
To people who say they do not believe women were raped on October 7th, what do you say to them?
What can I say to them? There's people who aren't willing to believe anything.
Yael Viask-Wiersman is gathering evidence to prosecute Hamas at the International Criminal Court in The Hague on behalf of the families of the victims. She believes the sexual violence was systematic.
If you have on the same day, in several places, the same kinds of acts, it's not a coincidence that these acts were committed.
Still, some Palestinians are skeptical, distrustful of any evidence gathered by Israeli authorities. It could take years to uncover the true extent of what happened on that October day, and longer still to prosecute those behind it. Danielle Ofek, Global News, near Raim, Israel.
Thanks so much. So I want to move on to Roz. Roz, you've been a victim of gender-based violence yourself, and you work to assist victims with, so many South Africans who believe that sexual violence can be justified. What do you believe drives this belief amongst some that rape and sexual violence can, in some instances, be okay?
Thanks, Annika. And just to say, it's such a privilege and honor to be on this panel with such amazing women. So, I don't need to say in this forum that the GBV and rape statistics in South Africa are horrendous. I mean, we are considered one of the 3 rape capitals in the world. The last statistics for the 2022 and 23 fiscal year showed 53,900 acts of sexual or gender-based violence taking place within that time period, of which 80% were classified as rape. So, we sit in a society where these types of acts are almost normalized. And so if we had to ask ourselves a question, what on earth is happening in our society that could perpetuate a belief or a justification for the act of rape? As you mentioned, we're part of this Women's Action Campaign South Africa. We conducted a poll where we explored South Africans' attitudes towards rape and gender-based violence in general before we became kind of more specific towards Israel. And what was absolutely shocking and alarming was that 1 in 4 South Africans believe that rape can be justified in certain circumstances. And of those 1 in 4, of that 25%, the results were spread equally between men and women. So why on earth would women say that rape can be justified in certain circumstances? So it's a really tough one to answer, but I think if we had to get maybe a little bit academic, I would say I would talk to maybe 3 factors that could influence this. The first one being cultural factors within South African society. So we live in a society where concepts like patriarchy and toxic masculinity are very much entrenched in our culture. And when I speak about this, I'm speaking about men as the perpetrators of gender-based violence. But let me just clarify at the outset that it is not only women that are the victims of gender-based violence. Within Kolane, we have dealt with men who are victims of sexual abuse, and we'll talk to that, I think, a little bit later. But just to say, when I'm explaining this now, I am talking in terms of the men as the main perpetrators of rape and gender-based violence. So when you have a culture where you have patriarchy, toxic masculinity, where men are kind of taught from children that in order to assert my position, I have to be aggressive, I have to be strong, I am the head of the household, what I say goes. And then you've got women who buy into this narrative because of the culture that they've been raised in, perhaps. Then you've almost got a case where the woman feels she's almost to blame when an attack happens. Did I provoke it? Was I dressed immodestly? Was I flirting? Was I argumentative? Did I talk back? Did I not know my place? And so in a way, they almost buy into the narrative that they did something and that what happened to them is almost justified. If we had to look at some historical perspectives, we are living in a post-apartheid generation. And unfortunately, we are still living with the effects of a history of apartheid and colonialism. So there are many men who are walking around with deep anger and resentment in terms of their place and their power and their authority in the world and in their country that they live in. And so how do they assert that power? Perhaps they assert that power at home or in, more of a domestic situation, because they feel powerless within themselves. So when they go home, or when they go to a situation where they're with somebody, a woman who they consider to be the weaker sex, the way that they can deal with their powerlessness is to assert power over that person. And that woman perhaps, feels that it's almost justified, or that she did something to get his ire or his anger. And you've also got women who are sitting in situations where they are economically struggling. They're financially dependent on their partner. Without their partner, they will have nowhere to live, no food on their table. So anything that happens to them, they kind of have to just sweep it away, accept it, deal with it, because they really have nowhere else to go. Their voices are silenced. And when you look at all these kind of factors and you think, well, what is it that could have led to that result, that women feel that rape is justified? It's quite scary to think that we're living in a society where these kinds of acts can be justified. And just on a last point, there's also a lack of education around what actually consent is, and that consent is actually a right. So a woman in a marriage who is financially dependent on their partner, or who sees herself as subservient, who then is forced, or her partner forces himself onto her, that is actually marital rape, and that is actually a crime under South African law. But how many women know this, and how many women would accept it? Might they not rather say, well, he's my husband, so, he's entitled to do this? So, it's a tough one to answer, but if we had to think about it, if I had to think about it in terms of the work that we do in Kolenu, those are the areas that would kind of speak to me.
Thanks, Roz. I would almost argue that we're actually in a war zone here in SA in many ways as women, because we can't walk around without feeling that at any time any of us could be targeted and used as objects, if you like, to demoralize and humiliate. But I want to go to Mushira, because Mushira, you're on the ground there, and you're dealing so often with women who have been survivors of extreme trauma and sexual trauma in Israel and Palestine, who are victims of abuse. What are your experiences? And if you could just chat to us a little bit about what you've experienced post October 7th.
So I'm an obstetrician and gynecologist, and I, for the past 13 years, I do on-calls in the Sexual Assault Treatment Center. Now, it's located in Israel, in the hospital that I work in, which is Hadassah Medical Center in Jerusalem. And actually, it's an acute treatment center for sexual assault. I don't like the word victims, but I would say like victims. We usually it operates 24/7, like all the time. We have staff on calls that are like consisted of a social worker that first comes to see the patient, and then she calls a staff of a medical doctor and a nurse. And the concept of this center is that everything revolves around the survivor. That means that everybody comes to her, like if it's a support system to treat, like people who treat her, and also the police if she decides to press charges. They will come to the center instead of sending her to multiple places after the trauma that she's experienced. Everyone can come, like every patient, even people with no medical insurance in Israel, even Palestinian women. I don't do this work in Palestine itself, but in like they come to the center in Jerusalem. Most of the survivors who come are women, but they're also men. Like I will talk mostly about like in female language, but that like also it is also said about men. Like there are fewer men, but they come. And that's what we do. Like, we do evaluation, we treat the patient, we take evidence if she decides, if she wants to. Like, but really the concept of, except for like everything revolving around the survivor, the concept is to getting her the control back as soon as possible after what happened. That means that she gets to decide what she wants to say, what she wants to tell us, if she wants to get checked, if she wants us to collect forensic evidence in case she decides to press charges, and she also decides if she wants to complain. And if she wants the police involved, she has time to think. Even after we finish the initial process, she can always think about it and then maybe decide later. About what happened in October 7th, like we as a center, as a hospital, did not get survivors from the October 7th events. But I think that things should be like more like, even if people wanted to hear what the like victims and survivors from those events like want to tell us, it's really hard for them to talk. Like in the first period, like every patient, every survivor who had been through such a traumatic event will not choose to talk. Sometimes, like even the survivors who come to our center, it's really hard for them to talk about it again, even if I need them to tell me what happened in order to be able to know what to look for in the physical examination that I do or the forensic evidence that I take. It's hard for them to speak. Like it's hard for them to talk. They might like relive the terrible experience, and also it can cause them re-traumatization. You think about that they need to tell it again to the social worker, to the medical staff, and then the police who comes to investigate. And this re-traumatization may also play a role in the development of later post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think that the most important thing, and we saw that with the hostages that have been released a few months ago, that they need a safe space, and for us to give them time to talk about what happened, even like if it's going to take months. Like I remember, I don't remember the name of the one of the hostages that was interviewed to the New York Times months after what happened, because first of all, I guess because she felt the urge to talk about it, to just raise awareness to what's happening to the hostages that are being held in captivity right now. And also because it takes time. It takes time to process everything, and also being willing to talk about what happened. Yeah, so definitely that should be like we should be aware of that, because I know that the expectation is that people like the hostages or the survivors who experience the sexual violence would talk immediately and about what happened, but it doesn't work like that.
No. And I think that's not just you know, in a war situation, that's also just in a general situation. But I think it's probably even harder when the world's media is almost salivating in a way to get the very traumatic details from survivors. But in many of these cases, I say victims because they're not alive to tell the tale. And in the Rape Crisis Center's report, you know, they had to rely a lot on Zakah, the body retrieval organization, for the kind of pathology reports to reflect where there had been cases of sexual violence perpetrated. I just want to remind everybody, thank you for your answers to the panel. If you've got questions, they need to go into the Q&A section, because the chat section has actually been disabled. So it's the Q&A section, and we'll trace all your questions there. It just seems to me, if we can move to the second part, is that the burden of responsibility seems very high for victims, and that's generally, but especially in this case, it seems as if, you know, I always liken it to our newsroom. We are seeing pictures of children in Gaza, and I'm not comparing the two at all, but we're seeing pictures of children in Gaza emaciated, and there's constant visual streams. And with this particular situation, it's such a private and terribly difficult. Very few women will go on camera and describe the atrocities that have been perpetrated against them. And I wanted to, you know, just say that reading those reports, I mean, many of the dead had their genitals sawn off with block cutters. There was extreme pelvic bleeding. There were knives inserted in their genitals, nails, hand grenades. Men were shot at too in their genital regions. There was almost an obsession in some cases, it would seem, in certain parts of the attacks, of the sexual violence being a tactic, a very preconceived tactic in order to provide the most horror. And Danielle, I want to ask you, and we've touched on this, why do you think you said you think it's anti-Semitism as to why the victims won't believe, but did many of the survivors keep the details of their abuse quiet and private for several reasons?
Okay, thank you. First of all, I agree with Mushira, and thank you for your work, Mushira. And the brave woman that spoke with New York Times is Amit Sosna. So just let you know her name. I think you know, you ask first why were the victims not believed? So the right question, I think, is what happened to the big feminists, to international organizations, women's group around the world, organizations that this is their mission statement, to believe all women. It is extremely terrifying to see how violence against Israeli women has been denied, ignored, contextualized, and even politicized. October 7 was a crime against humanity. Rape is not resistance. It's very important to me to say this. Sexual violence is never acceptable. Speaking out against gender-based violence can never become political. Sexual assault is unjustifiable. The UN's own report on October 7, sexual violence, took them 5 months to write and was a classic example of gaslighting. Even though the report itself admitted there was clear and convincing evidence of use of sexual violence as a weapon of war, it also minimized or denied other reports of violence, as well as eagerly hinted that, notably with no evidence, that Israel was also at fault for similar crimes. At the same time, right before the report about October 7 came out, the UN's Committee of Human Rights released a report which saw to call attention to unverified reports of IDF's abuse against women, as I told you, against and girls in Gaza. It is not a coincidence that the UN's human rights is headed by none other than Iran, Hamas' spiritual, ideological, and financial supporter. In short, misinformation and distortion of the facts happen when the organizations that are mandated to be natural are actually themselves engaging in perpetrating a specific narrative. In this case, we are mistaken to believe that any UN body is capable of putting out a reliable, trustworthy report and of compelling information without having an agenda. Unfortunately, the UN has become, a funhouse mirror entirely unreliable and guilty of distorting the truth of comical level. Again, everything was live streamed by the terrorists themselves. Today, we have eyewitnesses, testimonials from women that were in captivity and bravely shared their stories. What else? What else? What else did they want? To bring the chest of murdered women or women that brutally raped and murdered? What else we need to prove? What else? What happened is a crime against humanity, and it should be a global concern and concern of all humanity. My message to the world is that when brutal sexual violence is swept under the rug in our region, you embolden the perpetrators and enable it to continue happening elsewhere. This is my message.
Thank you, Dan. Mushira, I just wanted to ask you, in Israel, is it widely and commonly accepted in the medical community, and certainly in your sphere, that there was mass sexual violence inflicted on those victims of October the 7th? You're on mute, Doctor.
Do you mean if it was known in the medical community?
Is it accepted that it was very much part of what happened on that day?
Yes. I think that it took like a few days until people started until testimonies started to arrive from eyewitnesses that were in the parties and that were survivors from the party and the massacre. But yeah, I think that, yeah, and also the report, Physicians for Human Rights also issued the report on the gender-based violence used on October 7th. Yes, and it's very, I know, I'm not talking about the politics at the moment, but for us as doctors, it was very hard to see the denial around it, issues of victim blaming and denialism are it's something that I encounter in the media. Okay, in my work, I see the survivor, the patient. I don't see the perpetrator. I don't get to confront with him, and this is not my work. My work and I think of my other colleagues is, first of all, our assumption is that the survivor who comes to the center speaks the truth. This is the primary assumption that we use. When we leave judgment at the door, it's not a place for judgment. It's a place to provide treatment and support. And that's what we do. But I think that when the survivor experience the denialism and the victim blaming in the media or around her, if she decides to press charges and goes to court, this is something that can affect her chances of rehabilitation and coming out of it. It's very crucial to the healing part and treatment, to know that she is believed and that people don't question what happened. And I think it's very important to emphasize it.
Have you been surprised at the reports and the denialism, especially outside of Israel, that have been filtering in of what happened? Or is it something that you kind of expected?
No, actually, I didn't expect it. Again, this is not I really didn't expect it. And I think I'm not talking about the motives and what stands behind it, but it's definitely, it was surprising.
Yeah, I mean, me too, actually. And for me, a woman who's been sexually violated is a woman who's been sexually violated. I don't care who she is or her injuries are the same, you know. And Roz, that's why I'm going to bring it to you. Do you feel that the burden of proof for women in general is too high? You know, it often has to deal with a rape kit. There's almost so much secondary abuse that goes on. It's no wonder that people decide not to press charges often and to keep quiet, never mind in such a harrowing situation where, as I said before, there is so much media attention on what has happened.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we can link the high burden of proof to the lack of reporting or the very low rate of reporting. And we see that very often in the work we do. You know, we and myself have experienced that personally in trying to bring my perpetrator to account, where I was faced with threats, we were faced with death threats and intimidation before going to a trial. We had to go with a bodyguard. We were petrified. We didn't eat, we didn't sleep. And all of these factors contribute to women deciding to stay silent. First of all, the victim blaming, I think, is probably the biggest factor that keeps women silent. You know, when something has happened to you, it's a process before you will even talk about it. And the initial process of that is, did I cause this? Did I do something wrong? Am I overreacting? Was this my fault? And what are people going to say when they find out? So a lot of that is around the narrative that's in society. Or was her skirt too short? Was she drunk? Was she flirting? What did she do that caused this attack? You know, it must be something she must have done that provoked him. So that narrative is one that will keep women silent because they are so scared of the repercussions, of the shunning from their communities, particularly closed communities, religious communities. There's a lot of sweeping under the carpet, hush, hush. Let's not let this get out. We don't want to ruin our family reputation. You know, we don't speak about such things in our family, so rather just keep quiet and deal with it. And the victim blaming and the secondary traumatization that comes with that minimization of what's happened to you, the lack of belief and making you feel almost responsible is secondary traumatization. And research has shown that this secondary traumatization can actually be more damaging to a victim than the actual act of the abuse itself. And then, of course, you've got the whole legal system that is problematic, particularly in South Africa. We've got a burden of proof that a woman would have to prove what happened beyond a reasonable doubt. So when you've got a situation where there are no witnesses, it's a he said, she said situation, what woman is going to want to come forward and put herself through a whole legal process where chances are she's going to be discredited, her character is going to be attacked, and she's already, you know, had the victim blaming, she's already maybe, you know, experienced a lot of people who don't believe her or feel it was her fault, so why would she want to come forward and go through that? There's also, you know, a lot of loopholes that people can get through. There's corruption. If the perpetrator is powerful, if he or she has more money, what are the chances of a successful prosecution? And you know, we see with our work that very, very few cases get into the actual legal system because most times women are just, you know, they just decide that they're going to bow out. We encourage them obviously to get therapy and to, you know, go the path that will ensure their own healing. But to actually push somebody into going the legal route and having to look that high burden of proof in the face as a victim, as a survivor, as somebody who's been through a traumatic event is really, really asking a lot. So in terms of October the 7th, you know, I can't imagine that the survivors who are listening to the denial, the minimizations, the justification that this is resistance, I cannot imagine the pain, the triggering, the trauma that this must all just be compounding to what they've already been through, which is unimaginable trauma.
I think there's always this halo of shame that accompanies it, whether we're the most forward-thinking, emancipated, women. There is always that sense that your genitals are again being paraded for all to see in a public gallery, which is also something that's as you say, secondary victimization. But just moving to wrap up, how do we change this? What can we do? We're women. We have some responsibility collectively, all of us, just to do something to change this narrative. And I really want to ask you ladies, you women, what do you think we can do? And Roz, I'm going to start with you, because there's been a lack of condemnation by our government and civil society. We have the days of activism for sexual abuse against women and children. We're all kind of bored of it. Nobody pays much attention, but we're very sensitized to GBV. And South African government sent no statement out condemning the brutality of the attacks. And neither actually have a lot of women's organizations. Is that surprising to you?
Yes, I mean, it has been surprising to us. It's been absolutely horrifying at the same time. Silence is unconscionable. It's horrendous. And I know the day after the attack, the ANC national spokesperson came out and he said, well, this attack was unsurprising. And, this is Palestinians rising up against the Israeli apartheid regime. What is that? What kind of statement is that? That's justification. That's almost endorsement. And then we've got our president who came out 9 days later, brandishing the black clothing of Hamas and a keffiyeh, surrounded by his comrades waving Palestinian flags, and also basically no strong condemnation, no unequivocal condemnation, more a kind of, the Israelis kind of had it coming to them because of what they do to the Palestinians. So it's this competitive victimhood that was coming out all the time. And then the women's organizations, where's the ANC Women's League, for example, who shouts out a lot about GBV in the country and the rape statistics. So where were they in condemning this? What right do they have to be silent in the face of all of this? So, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the minimization and the denialism equates to silence for victims. Because if you're going to come out and say that these barbaric acts were as part of a resistance, that is silence to victims. If you're going to come out and bring in competitive victimhood and say, well, the Israelis kind of deserved it, and you can blame the Israeli government for what happened to their citizens because of what they do, in Gaza, then that is silence to victims. And that is silence to victims all over the world. And if you're going to also have a mentality that only people who are living in underprivileged or, difficult circumstances are actually your legitimate victims, and Israelis maybe can never really be seen as legitimate victims, that's also silence to victims all over the world. So when we talk about, we bandy this term out that says, can you hear the silence? And the silence is deafening. What does it actually mean? All these terms, all these justifications are silence to victims. And they are triggering and they re-traumatize. And for any victim anywhere in the world, listening to the denialism around the world, it's horrendous. There's nothing else to say. Our government, I'm sorry to say, it's a disgrace. It's disgraceful behavior, considering we are living in a country with one of the highest GBV stats in the world. We are on the continent of Africa, where we had things happening in Nigeria, where African Christian girls were kidnapped in 2014, were kidnapped again this year in Kuriga in Nigeria. You've got Mozambique, where ISIS is going in and raping and pillaging in villages. Isn't our government supposed to be the gatekeeper of the morality of our country? Aren't they the ones who are supposed to say, rape is rape? This is not okay. Look at our gender-based violence statistics. Look at the number of people getting murdered in our country on a yearly basis. Aren't they the ones who are supposed to make the stand and say, this is not okay? And what are we going to do about it? Rather, they endorse it, they justify it, and unfortunately, they keep silent about the fact that women, men, children were killed, were raped, were tortured. They keep silent about that. And for me, that silence equals complicity to a certain extent.
Roz, thank you for that, for wrapping that up. Because I feel as if it's really on us. We've been let down in every sphere when it comes to us as women. And I'll probably get into trouble for that, but in my experience, that's true. Mushira, just a last question for you. Have you learned anything from October the 7th?
Have I learned? Nothing that is new to me, that gender-based violence should not be used in any form or any justification. And this is something that should be clear to everybody, and especially someone who deals with sexual assault survivors like me. Like, it's not justified in any way. But I would like to say that I want to separate what the terrorists did on 7th of October and what's happening now in the war, where entire civilian population suffers from what's happening in Gaza. Yeah.
I just want to go to questions now. Thank you. There are so many questions. I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but it's actually great to see, because it shows that so many of you are engaged and have so much to ask from the knowledge that you guys have. First question is from Nicola, and it's for Danielle. She says, it seems like a lack of surviving victims is being used by denialists and media to push their agenda. But shouldn't the amount of dead victims of sexual violence indicate that Hamas's purpose was in fact genocide? Danielle.
Yeah, I founded the Me Too Unless You're a Jew. First of all, I want to just add something to Ashira and the panelist about the silence. Silence is a position. Silence in terms of evil is evil. Silence is a statement, and silence is a position. Please keep in mind. And for your question, so I founded Me Too Unless You're a Jew as a response to the silence of women's group and international organizations around the world and their hypocrisy. I also saw a chance to make a difference by utilizing my unique ability to combine social advocacy with a background in high tech, in order to make an impact. International organization and women's organization choose to be silent. The world chooses to be blind to the most evil and well-documented massacre. And I say, as you two said before me, if you tolerate this, your children will be next. About the decision to focus on UN women, right? I'm hoping I'm answering the question, unless you want to clarify something. So firstly, the UN women are role model for so many women's organizations around the world. They are considered to be the gold standard of women's advocacy, a trustworthy, reliable, and unbiased organization, which they are not, and we saw they are not. Their actions don't align with their mission statement of advocating for all women and girls, which has dangerous consequences, and we need to take care of it. I realized that no one else was coming to save us. Not doing anything was no longer a privilege any of us had, especially when you see false reports from the UN and UN women. I couldn't ignore it. This is also a huge challenge for us, because we've seen since October 7 that international humanitarian organizations carry their own biases and anti-Semitism. Lately, I will go over some reports. So lately, we saw the UN Human Rights Report from February 19th. In this report, they claim that the IDF are doing what Hamas did on a huge scale, with no evidence, with nothing. Unbelievable. Be sure that I respond to all of the reports. My responses are also published on major media, and by that reach to big audience. And you can see my reports on Washington Times and Daily Express and other major media. UN Women Actions make it clear their agenda aligns with the terror group Hamas at the expense of women and girls in Israel. We see this in their October 20 report, which was highly problematic, full of misleading information, ignoring the existence of Israel and completely ignoring what Israeli women and girls went through at the hands of terrorists. The recent January 20 report was so biased that they used figures from Hamas and mentioned Gazan men, including a suspected terrorist, while ignoring the pain of Israeli women and girls, including the hostages held by Hamas for over 6 months. You can read my response again in the Daily Express. The social media look as if they are UN Women of Gaza, post after post. Look at it, post after post, highlighting data from Hamas, while saying little to nothing about Israeli women and girls who were murdered, raped, mutilated on October 7, and since then as hostages. UN Women is clearly not for all women. We need to take care of this. We need to show the world. We need to hold the UN Women accountable. This is an issue, again, that concerns all humanity. And I hope I answered your question.
Danielle, thank you. Mushira, a question for you. Have there been any pregnancies resulting from October the 7th to your knowledge?
Well, my knowledge would be like the rest of the people's, as I said, like we weren't one of the centers that got to like treat the hostages that were freed. So I don't know. And to my knowledge, or at least not to the media, I don't have any. No, I don't know.
I know there was some concern that after the 3-month period had ended, there was some concern that women who were still being kept hostage couldn't terminate if they were pregnant. And so there was a sense of urgency to try and get.
So in Israel, well, I hope I would surely want them to be as soon freed as soon as possible. But in Israel, you can get through a committee that decides on termination of pregnancy later than 3 months, and even in very advanced months of pregnancies. But first they need to come back.
Thank you so much. And Roz, a very, very quick question for you, and I'm being told to wrap up, so I'm under the whip here. Just in terms of bringing it back to South Africa and other women against abuse organizations, have they reached out to you in any way to say, how can we help?
No, nothing. And in fact, we've reached out to them in different types of circumstances, even in terms of attending this webinar, and very little to no response from any of them.
I've been asked a question from Kenneth, and I'll use it to wrap up. And that is, why is the media and SA so hostile towards Israel? I think it's purely political. I think it's, I feel that all of us, in fact, are victims of politics, really. And I think the same goes for the media's reporting on Israel and historical bias. So that's my take on that. There's probably more. There's probably an unconscious anti-Semitism, and I say that with some hesitancy, but it's because it's a guess. So perhaps it would be irresponsible to say that, but I would say it's historical. Just to wrap up, we are recording, and this webinar will be on the WAXA website, and I really hope that the organizers who've done such a brilliant job in getting everybody together will consider a follow-up, because I think there's a step 2 here, and that is, what can we do? Because we've all been let down, all of us, and we need to try and put our heads together and see what we can do. As Danielle said, she realized that she had no choice but to do something. What we can do both at home and abroad in trying to hear the cries and support those who have been so traumatized and been subjected to sexual abuse in wartime and at home. So I'm going to wrap up with that. Please look for the recording on the WAX website by Wednesday. And lastly, just a huge thanks to all the panelists. You're wise women, and I can't thank you enough for taking part and giving us your time. You've been so generous. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Annika. Thank you, Annika. Thanks so much. Thank you all. Bye-bye.